There are moments in history that never make it into textbooks. Moments so quiet, so unexpected, that they slip through the cracks of official narratives and grand proclamations. Yet these are often the moments that reveal the truest nature of humanity. When enemies become healers, when pride dissolves into compassion, and when a simple loaf of bread becomes more powerful than 1,000 treaties. What you're about to hear is one of those stories. A story that unfolded in the devastated landscape of post-war Japan, in a half-destroyed hospital where exhaustion had replaced hope, and where an encounter between former enemies would challenge everything these people thought they knew about victory, defeat, and what it truly means to be human. Before we begin this journey together, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever witnessed an act of unexpected kindness that changed your perspective forever. The year was 1945, and the world was still reeling from the incomprehensible devastation of the war that had just ended. In the outskirts of Nagasaki, where the atomic blast had turned a thriving city into a landscape of ashes and broken dreams, there stood what remained of a civilian hospital. The building itself seemed to defy logic. Half its structure had collapsed into rubble, yet somehow the eastern wing remained standing, its walls cracked and scarred, its windows shattered, but still offering shelter to those who had nowhere else to go. This was not a military hospital, not officially. It had become a sanctuary for anyone who needed it. Civilians with radiation burns that no one yet understood. Soldiers who had returned home only to find there was no home left. Children orphaned by the blast. Elderly men and women whose bodies had survived, but whose spirits seemed to have departed with the mushroom cloud that had swallowed their world whole. Inside this broken sanctuary worked a group of Japanese nurses who had themselves become ghosts. Among the living, their leader, though no one had officially appointed her to such a role, was Nurse Fumiko Tanaka. At 32 years old, Fumiko had already lived several lifetimes. She had trained under the most rigorous conditions imaginable, in a medical system that valued discipline above all else, obedience before compassion, and sacrifice as the highest virtue. Her hands, once soft and delicate, had become calloused from endless hours of cleaning wounds with whatever materials could be found, sometimes just water, sometimes nothing at all. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with the idealism of a young woman entering a noble profession, now carried the weight of having watched hundreds die while being powerless to save them. She moved through the hospital corridors like a phantom, her traditional nurse's uniform, once pristine white, now stained with blood, ash, and the indefinable grime of desperation, hanging loosely on her diminishing frame. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 6 days. None of them had. The other nurses looked to Fumiko not because she was the eldest or most experienced, but because she possessed something that had become rarer than medicine itself. She had not yet surrendered her humanity. While others had begun to move mechanically through their duties, their faces blank masks of survival mode, Fumiko still spoke gently to the dying, still held the hands of the frightened, still found the strength to hum old lullabies to the children who cried out in the darkness. But even her reservoir of strength was running dry. The hospital had been without proper supplies for 3 weeks. The occupation forces had arrived in the region, and everyone had been told to wait for instructions, for organization, for some kind of system to be established. But instructions don't fill empty stomachs. Organization doesn't heal infected wounds. And systems don't comfort the dying child who calls out for a mother who is nothing but ash scattered across the ruins of what was once a neighborhood. On this particular morning, as dawn broke over the devastated landscape with an almost cruel beauty, the sun painting the ruins in shades of gold and amber that seemed to mock the ugliness of what had been done to this place, Fumiko was making her rounds in the children's ward. This section of the hospital haunted her the most. There were 17 children here, ranging in age from 3 to 14. Most had burns. Some had lost limbs. All had lost family. And all of them were slowly starving. The youngest, a little girl named Yuki, had stopped speaking 3 days ago. She just lay there, her enormous eyes following Fumiko's movements, her tiny hand clutching a charred doll that had been found in the rubble of her home. Fumiko knelt beside her bed, smoothing the child's matted hair, and whispered the only comfort she could offer. "Hold on, little one. Just hold on a little longer." But hold on for what? For whom? The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. It was then that Nurse Keiko burst through the door, her face flushed with a mixture of fear and confusion that immediately put Fumiko on alert. Keiko was the youngest of their group, barely 21, and she had always been the most emotional, the most reactive. The war had been particularly cruel to her. Her entire family had been in Hiroshima. "They're here," Keiko gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "The British. A whole convoy. They're pulling up to the hospital right now." The announcement sent a ripple of anxiety through the room. The nurses exchanged glances heavy with unspoken dread. They had all heard the stories, the warnings, the propaganda that had been drilled into them throughout the war about what to expect from the enemy. They had been taught that surrender meant humiliation, that occupation meant subjugation, that the foreign soldiers would show no mercy, especially to those who had served in any capacity related to the military medical corps. Even though they had only cared for the sick and wounded, they knew they could be viewed as part of the war machine. Fumiko rose slowly, her knees protesting after hours of kneeling, and straightened her soiled uniform as best she could. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of anxiety churning in her chest. "Maybe 20 or 30, Keiko replied. "They have trucks, military vehicles. They look organized." Organized was code for dangerous. Organized meant they had come with a purpose. Fumiko took a deep breath and turned to the other nurses who had gathered at the doorway. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn, "we continue to do our duty. These patients are under our care. We protect them. We serve them. That doesn't change, no matter who walks through that door. Do you understand?" They nodded, though she could see the fear trembling in their hands, the way they unconsciously drew closer to one another for comfort and courage. As Fumiko led them toward the main entrance of the hospital, her mind raced through possibilities, preparing herself for confrontation, for commands barked in a foreign language she barely understood, for the possibility that they would all be arrested or worse. The propaganda films she had been forced to watch during her training had painted vivid pictures of enemy brutality, of foreign soldiers who saw Japanese people as less than human, who would take pleasure in their suffering. She steeled herself, drawing on every reserve of dignity and courage she could muster. She would face whatever came with her head held high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. The main entrance of the hospital opened onto what had once been a beautiful courtyard garden, a place where patients could sit in the sunshine and contemplate the carefully arranged rocks and raked sand patterns that represented the eternal balance of nature. Now it was a field of rubble and weeds, the Zen garden buried under debris from the collapsed western wing. As Fumiko stepped out into the morning light, she had to squint against the brightness. And there, climbing out of military trucks and jeeps with the confident movements of trained soldiers, were the British medics. They wore their uniforms with an ease that spoke of certainty, of belonging to a victor's army, of knowing they now controlled this space, this city, this entire defeated nation. Fumiko's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. But then something happened that would shatter every expectation she had built up in her mind. One of the British soldiers, a young man with sandy hair and a face that still carried the softness of youth despite the hardness the war must have carved into him, looked directly at her. And he smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not a mocking smile. Not the smile of a conqueror reveling in the humiliation of the conquered. It was a gentle smile. An almost apologetic smile. A smile that seemed to say, "I know you're frightened. I know this is strange. But it's going to be all right." And then, as if to prove this impossible promise, he reached into the truck behind him and pulled out a canvas bag. From this bag, he extracted something that seemed almost miraculous in its ordinariness. A loaf of bread. Fresh bread. Real bread. The kind that Fumiko hadn't seen in months, maybe years. The kind that represented civilization, normalcy, sufficiency. The kind that represented everything they had lost. The young British medic walked toward her, his steps careful, his body language deliberately non-threatening. He was holding the bread out to her like an offering, like a peace treaty written not in diplomatic language but in the universal tongue of basic human need. Fumiko stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. This didn't match any scenario she had prepared for. Where were the orders? Where were the reprimands? Where was the punishment she had been taught to expect? Her hands remained at her sides, trembling slightly, unwilling or unable to reach out and accept what was being offered. She stared at the bread, then at the soldier's face, then back at the bread, her mind struggling to reconcile this reality with everything she had been told, everything she had believed about this moment. "Please," the soldier said in heavily accented but comprehensible Japanese, clearly having memorized a few crucial phrases. "You eat. You need strength." His voice was kind. How could a soldier's voice be kind? How could an enemy show concern for her strength? The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Fumiko felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become uncertain. She looked back at her fellow nurses, who stood clustered in the doorway, their faces mirrors of her own confusion and disbelief. Behind the young medic, other British soldiers were unloading crates from the trucks. But these were not weapons crates. They were medical supplies, boxes clearly marked with red crosses, and more food, bags of rice, tins of preserved goods, and bread. So much bread. One soldier was setting up a small camp stove and a large pot. He was preparing to make tea, she realized with a shock. Hot tea. For whom? For them? A commanding officer approached, an older man with medals on his chest and lines etched deeply into his face that spoke of having witnessed horrors that would never fully leave him. This, Fumiko thought, this would be the moment of reckoning. This man would issue the orders, establish the hierarchy, make clear the new reality of occupation and defeat. She bowed deeply, automatically, the ingrained gesture of respect and submission that had been trained into her since childhood. When she straightened, she found the officer looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You are the head nurse here?" he asked in English. One of his medics translated quickly. Fumiko nodded, finding her voice with difficulty. "I am Fumiko Tanaka. I oversee the nursing staff in what remains of this hospital." She waited for his response, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. The officer extended his hand. "Major William Patterson, Royal Army Medical Corps. We're here to help." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. As if British soldiers traveling to a devastated Japanese hospital to offer aid was a completely normal occurrence, and not something that defied every rule of the world, as Fumiko understood it. She stared at his outstretched hand. This gesture that in Western culture signified equality, partnership, respect. Everything in her training told her to bow again, to maintain the proper hierarchical distance between victor and vanquished. But something else, something deeper and more instinctive, made her reach out and clasp his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing, warm but not possessive. It was the handshake of one medical professional to another. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in Fumiko's understanding of what this day would bring. "Your patients," Major Patterson continued, his translator working smoothly beside him. "We understand they've been without adequate supplies and food. We've brought what we can. Medical supplies, food, water purification equipment. We'd like your permission to set up a joint operation here. Your staff knows these patients, knows their needs. We have resources and fresh personnel. Together perhaps we can actually save some lives." Permission. He was asking for her permission. Fumiko felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, a dangerous weakness she couldn't afford to show. She blinked them back fiercely. "We will accept any help that benefits our patients," she said, her voice formal, professional, hiding the earthquake of emotion happening inside her. "But I must know. What do you expect from us in return? What are your conditions?" It was the question she had to ask, the question any leader in her position would ask, because nothing came without a price. Surely this generosity had strings attached. Surely there would be demands, requirements, perhaps even humiliations disguised as charity. Major Patterson looked genuinely puzzled by her question, as if he didn't quite understand why she would ask such a thing. "Conditions? Miss Tanaka, the condition is that you let us help. That you work with us to keep these people alive. That's the only condition. We're not here to judge you or punish you. We're here because people are dying, and we're medics. It's what we do." The simplicity of it was almost offensive in its purity. Could it really be that straightforward? Could these soldiers really have traveled all this way simply to heal? Not to conquer, not to humiliate, not to impose their will, but just to heal? The young medic who had first offered her bread was still standing there, still holding out the loaf, his arm probably getting tired, but his expression patient and hopeful. Fumiko finally, slowly, reached out and took it. The bread was still warm. Impossibly, miraculously warm, as if it had been baked that very morning. Its weight in her hands felt substantial, real, like proof that this wasn't a dream or some kind of elaborate cruel trick. She brought it closer to her face and inhaled deeply. The smell hit her with the force of a physical blow. Yeast and grain and sustenance and life. Her knees nearly buckled. "When did you last eat?" the young medic asked gently, and Fumiko realized with embarrassment that she must look half-starved, which of course she was. 2 days ago, she admitted quietly, too tired and too overwhelmed to lie. A small bowl of rice shared between 3 of us. The medic's expression transformed into one of such genuine distress that Fumiko instinctively wanted to comfort him, to assure him she was fine, that this was normal, that she had endured worse. But before she could speak, he turned and called out to his companions. Within moments, several British soldiers had gathered around, and they were setting up a makeshift dining area right there in the ruined courtyard. Camp chairs appeared from nowhere. The pot on the stove was already steaming with tea. Real black tea with a fragrance that spoke of distant lands and normalcy and civilization. And more bread, and tins of jam, and even, impossibly, fresh butter. "Please," Major Patterson said, gesturing to the chairs. "Sit, eat. You can't care for your patients if you collapse from malnutrition. We need you healthy. That's not charity, Miss Tanaka. That's basic military logistics. You are a valuable resource, and we need you functioning at full capacity." Fumiko looked back at her nurses, who were still clustered uncertainly at the hospital entrance, watching this surreal scene unfold with expressions of hope warring with fear on their tired faces. She made a decision. "Keiko," she called out. "Gather the others. All of them. Tell them to come out here." As the nurses slowly emerged, moving with the careful uncertainty of people who have been hurt too many times to trust easily, the British medics sprang into action with impressive efficiency. More chairs materialized, more bread was sliced, the tea was poured into a motley collection of cups, some proper British Army issue, some clearly scavenged Japanese cups, that the soldiers must have found in the ruins and cleaned. One medic produced a small jar of sugar and went around offering spoonfuls to anyone who wanted it, treating this rare commodity with casual generosity that spoke volumes about the vast difference in circumstances between the 2 groups. Fumiko found herself seated between Major Patterson and the young sandy-haired medic, who introduced himself as Corporal James Whitmore from Yorkshire. "My mum's a nurse," he said conversationally as he carefully buttered a thick slice of bread and placed it on a plate in front of her. "Worked through the Blitz in London, she did. Never stopped, even when the bombs were falling. She taught me that nurses are the real heroes of any war, because soldiers destroy but nurses create. They create life out of the chaos we make. When I told her I was being sent here, she made me promise to honor any nurses I met, no matter which side they'd served on. Said nurses have no sides except the side of life." His words were so unexpected, so perfectly calibrated to pierce through Fumiko's defenses, that she felt the tears she had been holding back begin to spill over. She tried to hide them, raising her cup of tea to her face as cover. But Major Patterson pretended not to notice, simply continuing to speak in a matter-of-fact tone about the medical supplies they had brought and how he hoped Fumiko could help them understand the specific needs of their patients. As the Japanese nurses began to eat, tentatively at first, then with the desperate hunger of people who had been starving for weeks, something remarkable happened in that ruined courtyard. The British soldiers didn't stand apart and watch. They sat among them. They poured more tea. They passed the butter and jam. They asked questions about the patients, about the hospital's history, about what had been here before the blast. And slowly, incredibly, tentatively, conversations began. In broken English and even more broken Japanese, supplemented with hand gestures and drawings in the dust, these 2 groups of people who had every reason to hate each other began to find their common ground. They talked about patients they had lost. They talked about the frustration of watching people die from lack of supplies. They talked about the nightmares that followed them from battlefield hospitals and bombed-out medical stations. They talked about why they had chosen to be healers in a world that seemed determined to destroy. Nurse Keiko, the youngest and usually the most timid, found herself sitting next to a British medic named Thomas, who had a photograph of his little sister, a girl about the same age as Yuki, the silent child in the ward upstairs. "She has cancer," Thomas said quietly, showing Keiko the photo of a smiling girl with a bald head. "That's why I became a medic. Couldn't save her with my hands, but I thought maybe I could save someone else's sister." Keiko understood. She told him about her family in Hiroshima, about not knowing for 2 weeks if they had survived, about finding out that they hadn't. Thomas didn't offer empty platitudes. He just nodded and poured her more tea, and they sat there together in their shared understanding that the war had taken things from both of them that could never be returned. But not everyone in that courtyard was experiencing this moment of connection with the same openness. Among the British soldiers was a sergeant named Reginald Hawthorne, a career military man in his mid-40s with a rigid bearing and a face that seemed carved from granite. He stood apart from the breakfast gathering, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of barely concealed disapproval. He had fought in Burma, had seen what the Japanese military had done to British prisoners, had lost men under his command to brutalities that still haunted his sleep. And now he was expected to break bread with them, to treat them as colleagues? The very thought made his blood boil with a righteous anger that he felt was entirely justified. Major Patterson noticed his sergeant's isolation and walked over to him. "Something on your mind, Hawthorne?" he asked quietly. The sergeant's jaw clenched. "With respect, sir, I don't understand why we're coddling them. They were the enemy. Their people committed atrocities, and we're serving them tea and biscuits like this is some kind of garden party?" Major Patterson sighed, a sound that carried the weight of too many difficult decisions made in impossible circumstances. "Look at them, Sergeant. Really look at them. What do you see?" Hawthorne forced himself to look, his expression still hard with judgment. "I see the enemy, sir. I see people who supported a regime that tortured and killed our men. You see starving women who've been working 20-hour days trying to save lives with no supplies and no support?" Patterson corrected gently but firmly. "You see medical professionals who've stayed at their posts even after their own government abandoned them, even after their entire city was obliterated. You see people who are doing exactly what your wife did during the Blitz, standing firm in the face of horror and choosing life over death. The war is over, Sergeant. We won, and now we have a choice. We can extend the suffering or we can end it. Which choice honors the men we lost? Which choice prevents future wars?" Hawthorne's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first crack in the armor of his conviction. "They don't deserve our help, sir. Not after what their army did." "Maybe not," Patterson agreed, surprising his sergeant. "Maybe they don't deserve it. Maybe none of us deserve any of the kindness we receive in this world. But deserving isn't the point. Humanity is the point. If we make our compassion conditional on deserving, then we're no better than the regimes we fought against. We become the thing we claim to oppose." It was at this moment that a commotion erupted from inside the hospital. A young Japanese man, barely more than a boy, perhaps 19 or 20, came stumbling out of the building. He was wearing the tattered remains of a Japanese military uniform, his arm in a filthy makeshift sling, his face gaunt with hunger and bright with the fever of infection. This was Takeshi, a former soldier who had returned home to find nothing left, who had been receiving treatment at the hospital for an infected wound that was slowly killing him. And Takeshi had heard, through the walls and windows, what was happening in the courtyard. He had heard Japanese nurses laughing with British soldiers. He had heard collaboration, betrayal, surrender of the only thing left, their pride. "How dare you!" Takeshi's voice rang out across the courtyard, shrill with fury and pain and the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. "How dare you sit with them, break bread with them? They destroyed our city. They killed our families. And you smile and drink their tea like they're our friends?" He was shaking with rage, with fever, with the toxic combination of physical weakness and emotional anguish that made him dangerous in his unpredictability. Every person in the courtyard had frozen. The moment of connection that had been building so carefully was suddenly as fragile as spun glass. Fumiko stood immediately, her expression transforming from the softness of shared humanity back to the mask of professional control. "Takeshi-san," she said firmly, moving toward him with her hands visible and non-threatening. "You need to return to your bed. Your fever is—" "My fever is nothing," he shouted, spittle flying from his cracked lips. "My fever will kill one person, me. But this collaboration will kill the soul of our people. Have you forgotten who you are? Have you forgotten what they did to us?" Sergeant Hawthorne, vindicated in his suspicions, moved his hand toward his sidearm. This was what he had expected. Hostility, violence, proof that these people could not be trusted, that compassion was wasted on them. But Major Patterson placed a restraining hand on his sergeant's arm, a silent command to stand down. Fumiko continued to approach Takeshi slowly, her voice calm but carrying an edge of authority that came from years of managing delirious and frightened patients. "I have forgotten nothing, Takeshi-san. I remember every patient we lost because we had no antibiotics. I remember every child who died of starvation while we watched helplessly. I remember the blast that took my sister and her children. I remember all of it, every moment, every loss. I carry them all." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, revealing the depth of pain she usually kept hidden beneath her professional composure. "But tell me, Takeshi-san, what good does remembering do if it only binds us to more suffering? What honor is there in starving ourselves when help is offered? What victory is there in watching more people die from treatable infections when medicine is available? Takeshi's face contorted with anguish. They don't offer help from kindness. They offer it to humiliate us, to make us dependent, to show their superiority. It was Corporal Whitmore, surprisingly, who stepped forward to respond. His Japanese was poor, but his translator worked quickly, and his words carried a simple honesty that cut through the rhetoric. My brother died at Singapore, he said quietly. Died in a prison camp. I'm not going to lie and say I don't carry anger about that. I do. I probably always will. But I'll tell you something else I carry. A letter from home. Last thing my brother wrote before he was captured. You know what he wrote? He wrote, "If I don't make it, make sure you live. Make sure you build something instead of just destroying. Make sure my death meant something by making something better from all this waste." Whitmore's voice thickened with emotion. You think offering you bread humiliates you? You know what would humiliate you? Letting more people die just to protect your pride. You know what would honor the dead? Saving the living. All of them. No matter what uniform they wore or what flag they served under. The courtyard was utterly silent except for the sound of Takeshi's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a crow somewhere in the ruins. Every person there, British and Japanese alike, was holding their breath, waiting to see which way this moment would break. Takeshi's eyes were wild, moving from face to face, looking for support, for validation of his anger. But when he looked at his fellow patients who had gathered at the windows and doorways to witness this confrontation, he saw something that shook him. They were not looking at him with agreement or solidarity. They were looking at him with sadness, with pity, with the exhausted frustration of people who were too tired, too hungry, too broken to sustain hatred anymore. One old woman, her face scarred with burns from the blast, spoke up in a voice like dry leaves rustling. Let them help, boy. I have already lost 3 sons to this war. I will not lose my dignity by accepting bread from former enemies. I lost my dignity when I ate bark from trees to survive. I lost my dignity when I drank contaminated water because I was dying of thirst. Accepting help from people who offer it freely? That's not loss of dignity. That's wisdom.